The strangest thing about Mary Boleyn isn't what happened to her. It's that we're not entirely sure anything happened to her at all. No dramatic finish, no great recorded moment, no convenient letter explaining where she went. She was at court, then she wasn't. And history, which has the attention span of a toddler and a weird kink for misery, simply shrugged and moved on to her more theatrical sister, which is exactly why she's worth finding. Everyone knows the sister, the one who lost her head because she couldn't give the king a son, or because she had 6 fingers, or whatever other rubbish the Victorian novelists decided to invent over their sherry. But there was another one, Mary, the elder sibling. We're tracking a woman who managed something entirely miraculous for a Tudor aristocrat. She disappeared, not in a spooky ghost ship sort of way, but she simply walked out of the frame of the most dangerous family soap opera in English history and stayed alive. Think about it. In a family where a trip to the Tower was practically a genetic inheritance, she died in her own bed, probably listening to the rain on an Essex roof. How do you do that? You do it by becoming thoroughly, brilliantly unimportant. But before she managed that bit of vanishing magic, she had to survive the French court. It all kicks off around 1514. Mary is part of the baggage train for Mary Tudor. No, not that one. The other one, Henry VIII's sister, who is heading across the Channel to marry the old, ailing French king Louis XII. Louis was 70-something and apparently looked like a dried prune, while Mary Tudor was 18 and gorgeous. A bit of a mismatch, obviously. Our Mary Boleyn is just a teenager. The French court wasn't like Westminster. It was smaller, hotter, more intellectual, and significantly more obsessed with who was sleeping in whose bed. Louis XII didn't last long. Married in October, dead by January, supposedly because his young bride wore him out, which is a hilarious bit of historical gossip if you think about it. And then Francis I takes the throne. Now, Francis was a different beast altogether. Tall, big nose, fancied himself a bit of a poet and a massive ladies' man. This is where Mary's reputation gets dragged through the mud, mostly by Francis himself, who later called her his English mare and the greatest mistress among all his ladies. Charming bloke. These damaging quotes were often written by men hostile to the Boleyn family and the English Reformation, who sought to blacken Anne Boleyn's name by dragging her sister's reputation through the mud. You have to wonder if he was just bragging to his mates or if Mary was genuinely wild. You're 15, you're away from your strict dad, the French wine is flowing and everyone is wearing silk. Why not? Though honestly, some historians think Frances made the whole thing up to spite her father later on. Anyway, Thomas Boleyn, her father, is watching all this from London and France. Because he's an ambassador. He's the ultimate pushy parent. He sees Mary getting this name for herself and decides, right, time to bring her home before she completely ruins her market value. Or maybe he realised she'd served her purpose. The French court was a finishing school, but Mary had finished a bit too thoroughly. She gets recalled. She's no longer the innocent girl who left Kent. She knows things. She knows how the French nobility handle affairs, discreetly usually with a poem attached, whereas the English court was far more blunt about it. Her sister Anne is still over there, by the way, learning how to play the lute and refuse kings, which Mary clearly hadn't mastered. Anne was always the clever one. Mary was just, well, she was available. When she gets back to England, she's dropped straight into the royal household. Queen Catherine of Aragon needs maids of honour, mostly to stand around looking pious while the king plays real tennis in tight trousers. Henry VIII at this point isn't the fat bloke from the Holbein paintings. He's 28, got all his teeth, a full head of auburn hair, and can ride a horse for 50 miles without complaining about his hip. He's also getting a bit bored of Catherine, who keeps having miscarriages and spending her time praying. Enter Mary. She's fresh from France, she's got that Parisian walk. It didn't take long for Henry to notice. The affair itself is a weirdly quiet thing. There are no grand love letters left behind like the ones Henry wrote to Anne later. No poems, just a few entries in the royal accounts for jewellery and silk. It's almost as if Henry wanted her, but didn't want anyone to make a fuss about it. He was funny like that. He could be utterly shameless, but then he'd get these weird fits of morality where everything had to look respectable on paper. So, Mary becomes the royal mistress, but without the title. Which brings us to the logistics. You can't just have a king hanging around a teenager's bedchamber without people talking, especially the Spanish ambassador, who wrote down literally everything he saw, including how many times the king went to the toilet. Thomas Boleyn needs a fix. He needs a husband for Mary, someone who won't mind the king popping in for tea, so to speak. Someone respectable but malleable. A court insider who knows how to keep his mouth shut and his pockets open. They find a bloke named William Carey. He's a cousin of the king, actually, which makes the whole thing even more incestuous than it already was. But that's the Tudors for you. Everyone was related to everyone else, which probably explains the state of their teeth. The wedding happens in February 1520. It's not a small affair either. Henry actually shows up and gives them a present of money. Imagine that. The king attends your wedding, smiles at your dad, shakes hands with your new husband, and everyone in the room knows he's been sleeping with the bride and will probably continue to do so on Thursday. But Carey seems fine with it. He gets appointed to various offices, gets some land, and Mary stays at court. The system works. For now. But then things start to shift. The king's eye starts to wander again, because that's what Henry's eye did. It was like a lighthouse, never staying on one spot for too long. And Mary, despite her French training, didn't have that iron will that her sister had. She gave in too easily. Once the king had had his fill, the mystery was gone. He liked the chase. With Mary, there wasn't much of a chase. It was more of a stroll in the park. One day you're the centre of the universe, receiving gold cups and fine linen, and the next you're just another court wife trying to manage a household budget, while your husband spends all his time chasing deer with the king. Henry had moved on. He was like that with everything. Guitars, theology, women. He'd get completely obsessed, stay up all night writing music or reading Latin, and then suddenly he'd leave the instrument in a corner to gather dust. Mary was the guitar in the corner. It's during this period, around 1522, that a major shift happens, though nobody noticed at the time because everyone was too busy watching a tournament Shrovetide joust, where Henry fell off his horse. Anne comes back. The younger sister is finally home from her long stay abroad, and she enters the court like a cat walking into a room full of pigeons. Anne wasn't like Mary. She doesn't just join the Queen's household, she completely eclipses Mary. During the famous Chateau Vert pageant, there's Mary, the ex-mistress, sitting quietly with her lower-ranking husband, and there's her little sister, dancing in front of the king during a pageant, wearing a dress covered in silver foil and representing perseverance, or some other virtue she probably didn't possess. Henry, of course, notices immediately. He doesn't jump her right away. Anne wouldn't let him, which was her grand, tactical masterpiece. The court was a very small place, despite all the grand halls, and everyone knew who was up and who was down, based on where they were allowed to sit. Mary's seat was moving backwards toward the door. We don't have any diaries from Mary, which is a massive pain for historians, but probably great for her own neck. Imagine if she'd written down what she thought of her sister's behaviour. Anne is doing that thing with her eyes again. Henry looked like he was going to sick up his venison. It seems likely that Mary was actually quite relieved to be out of the direct line of fire. Being the king's mistress meant every Spanish and imperial spy was trying to bribe your servants to find out what you talked about after midnight. Now, she could just be Mrs. Carey. But things get complicated again because Mary gets pregnant. Twice, actually. First comes Catherine, around 1524, and then young Henry in 1526. And this is where the gossip columns of the 16th century go absolutely wild. Because of the timing, everyone starts whispering that the kids aren't Careys at all. They're the king's bastards. The evidence is, well, it's basically non-existent, but that didn't stop people. There's a chaplain later on who mentions that young Henry Carey looked exactly like Henry VIII, right down to the nose. If you look at the dates, the affair with Mary was supposedly over by the time the kids were conceived, but kings have a habit of revisiting old hunting grounds when they're bored. It's entirely possible that Henry Carey was a royal child, which would make him the half-brother of Elizabeth I. Think about the Christmas parties. Pass the gravy, half-brother who can't inherit the throne. William Carey didn't seem to care either way, or if he did, he kept it to himself, because criticising the king's access to your wife was a quick way to find out what the inside of a dungeon smelled like. And then, just as Anne is getting her teeth into the king, and the whole great business of the divorce from Catherine of Aragon is starting to brew. A particularly nasty bout of the sweating sickness hits London. It was a terrifying disease. You'd be fine at breakfast, sweating by lunchtime, and dead by supper. It didn't care about your titles or your cousinship to the monarch. It just took you, the sort where the king drops everything and moves to a different house every 3 days, terrified of catching a draft or breathing the same air. Mary's husband didn't manage to run fast enough. He catches it, and within hours he's gone, leaving Mary with 2 small kids and a massive mountain of debt, because Carey had been living way beyond his means, trying to keep up with the blokes who had 10 times his income. Mary is suddenly a widow at 28. No money, no husband to speak up for her at the counting house. It's a complete disaster in that world, because a woman without a man or an inheritance was basically invisible to the law. Her dad, who was busy trying to become an earl at the time, didn't want to know. He was a proper miser when it came to his kids, unless they were actively bringing home a crown or a manor house, so he basically told her to sort herself out. She had to write to the king, or rather, she got Anne to speak to the king, which shows that the sisters weren't completely at each other's throats yet. Henry, who could be strangely generous when he was feeling guilty or when he was trying to impress Anne, steps in. He gives Mary an annuity of £100 a year, which was decent money back then, enough to buy a few cows and keep the roof repaired. So Mary retreats. She goes back to the country, maybe down to Essex or Kent, out of the way of the plague and the politics. She's essentially a pensioner now, living on royal charity while her sister is locked in this massive 5-year legal battle with the Pope about whether Henry's first marriage was valid. It must have been bizarre watching it from the sidelines, reading the newsletters that arrived with the carrier pack, seeing her little sister becoming the most hated woman in England. It was a small life compared to the galleries of Greenwich, but it was safe. Her daughter Catherine was growing up, becoming a sharp girl who probably looked a bit like the Boleyns, all dark hair and quick eyes, while young Henry Carey was off being raised in Anne's grand household. By 1532, the whole business is reaching a boiling point. Henry takes Anne to Calais for a big diplomatic meeting with the French king, the same Francis who used to brag about Mary, which must have made for some spectacular behind-the-scenes tension if Francis brought it up. Mary actually went along on that trip as one of Anne's ladies. Imagine the dinner table. Francis looking across at Mary, then at Anne, then at Henry, who is sitting there looking like a dog that's finally caught the car. Did Mary and Francis have a quiet chat in the gallery while the musicians were playing? We'll never know. The official records just list her name among the attendants. When they get back, Anne is finally pregnant, which was the whole point of the exercise, and Henry marries her in secret. Then comes the coronation. But the crowds in London were completely silent, because they still loved old Queen Catherine. Mary is right there in the middle of it, holding Anne's train, helping her into her robes at Westminster Abbey. She's now the sister of the Queen. You'd think that would be her ticket back to the top, a chance to grab some real power or a rich second husband from the high nobility. But Mary had other ideas. She was about to do something so monumentally stupid, from a courtier's point of view, that it looked like social suicide. Or maybe it was the smartest thing she ever did. It depends on whether you think life is about getting a bigger coat of arms, or actually getting some sleep at night, without wondering if someone is going to accuse you of treason. She met a bloke named William Stafford, who was just a soldier at the Calais garrison, a nobody, a man with a pike and a monthly wage that wouldn't have paid for one of Anne's sleeves. And she fell for him, or maybe she just wanted someone who didn't look at her and see a way to get a meeting with the king. But by 1534, she'd gone and done it. She married him, in secret obviously, because if her father Thomas or her sister the Queen found out, there'd be absolute hell to pay. The secret didn't last long because Mary got pregnant. You can't really hide a baby when your job involves standing around in tight corsets waiting for the Queen to finish her soup. The belly was showing, and the whole thing came out like a bucket of cold water over the court's head. Anne was absolutely furious. She felt completely insulted that her own sister had dragged the family name again through the mud by marrying a common soldier. It made the Boleyns look cheap. Thomas Boleyn was probably spitting feathers too. He'd spent his whole life calculating the exact value of every cousin and niece, and here was his eldest daughter giving herself away for nothing. They didn't just give her a telling off, they kicked her out, completely banished from court. Henry, who usually did whatever Anne wanted when she was pregnant or shouting, signed the order, and Mary and her soldier husband were told to pack their bags and get out of Whitehall. But Mary didn't back down. Instead of crying and begging her dad for forgiveness, she wrote a letter to Thomas Cromwell. He was known for having a bit of a soft spot for people in trouble, provided they didn't get in the way of his political plans. She doesn't apologise for marrying Stafford. She basically says, "Look, I know he's poor, but he's honest and he loves me, and I'd rather beg my bread with him than be the greatest queen in Christendom." That's a direct dig at her sister Anne, obviously. It's a massive gamble, telling the king's right-hand man that you prefer a poor soldier to a royal crown. But Mary was clearly past caring about the court game. She asked Cromwell to speak to the king and her father to get them to give her some money, because Stafford's wages weren't enough to buy bread for the children she already had, let alone the new one on the way. He did try to help her a bit, apparently, by dropping a hint to Henry, but the Boleyns weren't budging. Anne refused to see her. Her father cut off her allowance completely. They wanted her dead to the world, a non-person who didn't exist in the official logs anymore. So the Staffords went away. Some people think they went down to Rochford in Essex, which was an old estate belonging to her mother's family, the Ormondes, but there's no real proof they were there yet. Some records suggest it was a boy named Edward Stafford. Others say it died in the cradle, which was common enough back then when the local doctor's main cure for a fever was putting a dead chicken on your feet. Meanwhile, back in London, the Grand Boleyn Empire was starting to show some massive cracks. Anne hadn't produced the son Henry wanted, just little Elizabeth, who nobody thought would ever amount to much, and the king was already starting to look at Jane Seymour's pale face and quiet manners with a bit of interest. Mary was out of it all, safe in her poverty, while her sister was locked in that golden cage. If Mary had stayed at court, if she'd married some grand duke like her father wanted, she'd have been right in the middle of the trial when everything went sideways. She'd have been forced to testify against her own brother or sister, or worse, she'd have ended up in the row of seats next to them. Her letters to Cromwell had done a bit of good, maybe, because there's a tiny record of Anne sending her a golden cup and some cash, but it was done under the table. Then 1536 arrives. May 1536, the month where the Boleyn name goes from being the highest in the land to nothing. George Boleyn in the Tower being accused of things with his own sister that, frankly, don't bear thinking about. The whole thing was a set-up, obviously. Cromwell needed to clear the deck for Henry to marry Jane Seymour, and the quickest way to do that was to paint the Boleyns as a bunch of monsters. Where was Mary during those 2 weeks when her brother and sister were waiting for the axe? Nobody knows. Not a single letter survives. Not a scrap of gossip from any ambassador about Mary trying to get to London to see them. Some people say she was barred from the city. Others think she just stayed away out of pure survival instinct. If you show up at the Tower asking to see an accused traitor, the guards don't usually just say, "Right this way, madam." They look at your face, they remember your surname, and then they find an empty room for you on the ground floor. I reckon she was terrified, with fear that the king's men would come to take her children away, or her husband, or her. Probably she stayed put. It sounds cold, letting your siblings die without a peep. But when the king decides he wants a clean sweep, naturally you don't stand in the way unless you want to join the pile. George went to the scaffold first on the 17th of May, and then Anne 2 days later. After the tragic downfall of her siblings and the later death of her father, Mary finally found financial stability. Through the settlement of her father's estate and grants from King Henry VIII, she inherited Rochford Hall in Essex. While it lacked the royal splendour of Greenwich, but it provided Mary with the means to live a comfortable and respectable life as a country gentlewoman, away from the dangers of the Tudor court. This is the bit of her life where the map completely loses her. She moves into Rochford Hall around 1540, and the historical record just goes out. She isn't mentioned in the court guest lists. She doesn't show up at the christenings of Henry's new babe, Edward. She spent her final years alongside her husband, managing her estates. It was a quiet country life that required no official correspondence to be preserved in the state papers. Living in that manner, she finally had everything she needed, which is likely why she never wrote to anyone again. If we think about what was going on in London at the time, Henry was busy marrying Catherine Howard by then. Mary stayed out of it. She didn't write to her cousin Catherine, she didn't ask for a position at court for her daughter, and she stayed well away from any palace. We don't know much about her marriage to Stafford during this country period, but it seems to have been quite solid, which is a bit of a rarity for the Tudors and even now. Stafford wasn't a great political brain, but he seems to have been a decent bloke who knew how to manage an estate without getting into debt, and he didn't have any grand ambitions that would involve his head being stuck on a spike on London Bridge. They had a quiet life. By 1541, the family name is dragged through the dirt yet again when Catherine Howard loses her head, for the same reasons Anne did, more or less. The royal court considered the women of this family to be corrupt and treacherous to the throne. Anyone with a drop of Boleyn or Howard blood in them was looking over their shoulder. But the king's men never came to Rochford Hall, and then, in July 1543, the candle finally goes out for good. She dies at Rochford Hall. No grand funeral, probably. She was just buried in the local churchyard or under the aisle of the parish church, as was done with the local nobility, or in its courtyard. And 13 years later, her husband followed her. To heaven or to hell, I'm no god to decide. But the story doesn't actually end with her stone getting covered in moss. Because while Anne's daughter Elizabeth was sitting in Hertfordshire, wondering if her father was ever going to let her come to court, Mary's kids were waiting in the wings. Mary had played the long game without even realizing it. By disappearing into the background, she'd kept her bloodline alive, and that bloodline was about to have its own back on the people who had cast her out. Her daughter, Catherine Carey, grows up to be a very sharp, very loyal woman who ends up getting appointed as a maid of honour to her own first cousin, Princess Elizabeth. Catherine marries a bloke named Sir Francis Knollys, and they end up being the ultimate safety net for Elizabeth when she finally takes the throne in 1558. And then there's Mary's son, young Henry Carey. Elizabeth makes him Lord Hunsdon almost immediately after her coronation, and she gives him a massive house and some seriously heavy jobs, like guarding the Scottish border. Hunsdon was a proper old-school Englishman. He didn't speak any foreign languages, he swore like a bargee, and he had a habit of hitting people with his staff if they didn't move out of his way fast enough. Elizabeth loved him for it, because he was one of the few men at court who didn't try to flirt with her, or write her terrible poems about her eyes. He just told her the truth about how many soldiers were dying of the flux in Berwick. If you think about it, the king had discarded Mary as a cheap bit of fun 60 years earlier, but when the chips were down and the Spanish fleet was coming up the channel, it was Mary's boy who was holding the sword to protect the realm. What's even more wild is the sheer number of kids Catherine Carey had. She managed to flood the Elizabethan court with a small army of cousins, nieces and nephews, who all had Mary Boleyn's DNA floating around in them. One of Catherine's daughters was Lettice Knollys, who turned out to be an absolute nightmare for Queen Elizabeth, because she went and secretly married Robert Dudley, who was the love of Elizabeth's life. Elizabeth was so angry when she found out that she boxed Lettice's ears and threw her out of court forever, which is a lovely bit of family history repeating itself since Mary had been thrown out for a secret marriage 50 years before. So while the main Tudor line was completely drying up, because Elizabeth refused to marry anyone and died without a single kid to her name, Mary's descendants were multiplying like rabbits in the background. If you trace the family tree down through the centuries, Mary's blood flows into almost every single grand noble family in Britain. It goes through the Earls of Essex, the Dukes of Devonshire, right down to the modern royal family. Diana Spencer was a direct descendant of Mary Boleyn, which means King Charles, Prince William, and that little lad Prince George are all carrying the genetic code of the English mayor, who Francis I thought was just a disposable court joke. To dive deeper into this, watch this video where I break down the blood connection between Elizabeth I and Elizabeth II. Anne got the crown and the tragedy, George got the axe, and the old man got a lonely death in a dark house. But Mary? Mary got the future. She got to sit back in her brick house in the damp fields of Essex, listening to her soldier husband talk about the price of hay, while her children and grandchildren quietly took over the country by simply staying alive and having babies,